In the 10-year span since the 9/11 attacks, more non-Muslims than ever have undertaken to learn about Islam, to understand the religious motives of those who have declared war on us. And yet we non-believers who are alarmed at what we have found in the foundational texts of Islam are always told by Islamists and their apologists that we don't understand the true Quran, that we labor under misconceptions about the religion of peace. Now, how's that? Better? Wow, okay, I'm going to put my lips right on it. We're always told that we don't understand the complexities of Sharia, that our objections and our criticisms are nothing more than racism, even though Islam is not a race. And of course, Islamophobia, an irrational fear of Islam and its adherents. The problem always seems to lie with us. And so the Islamists always keep us off balance through accusations and obfuscations and contradictions and mystification. One of the things we're all apparently confused about, except for Jimmy Carter, is the swelling tide of Jew hatred emanating from the triumphant Islamists throughout the Middle East in the wake of the farcically mislabeled Arab Spring. For example, an Egyptian cleric recently openly addressed Jews on behalf, he says, of 85 million Egyptians whose hearts beat with hatred for the Jews. These Jews are a cancer, he said, a catastrophe. There is not a catastrophe in the world that is not the handiwork of the Jews. They are a cancer in the body of planet Earth, and if permitted, it will spread and infect the entire body. Getting rid of these Jews is a must. Well, that seems like fairly straightforward Jew hatred to us unenlightened infidels. And yet we're told that Islam is a religion of interfaith tolerance, or that what we're mistaking for contemporary Islamic anti-Semitism is just a reaction to Israel's occupation and genocidal oppression of the Palestinians, or that it's not intrinsic to Islam but derives instead from the influence of Nazism, or that it's a perversion of Islam on the part of a tiny minority of extremists. So what are the true roots of Islamic Jew hatred? Well, Dr. Andrew Bostom is here to tell us. An associate professor of medicine at Rhode Island Hospital, the major teaching affiliate of Brown University Medical School, he's the author of two essential, extraordinary, and meticulously documented works of scholarship, The Legacy of Jihad and The Legacy of Islamic Antisemitism, and of the upcoming book Sharia versus Freedom. He's published articles and commentary on Islam on Front Page and in the Washington Times, National Review Online, Revue Politique, American Thinker, and elsewhere, both in print and online. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to present to you the man that the obfuscators don't want you to listen to, Andrew Bostom.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction, Mark, and special thanks to Doris for all the work that's gone into organizing this talk and the many events that Doris organizes. I just wrote down for myself 4 points of emphasis that I'd like to address tonight. Just briefly to talk about the inspiration for my first two books and how I segued from the initial compendium to the second. I wanted to provide for you, and that's the purpose of some of these few PowerPoints I put together, to give you some concrete illustrations of the major anti-Semitic motifs from Islam's canonical texts, in particular the Quran, by means of video clips, memory segments, Palestinian Media Watch segments, etc. They only last about 10 minutes. Thirdly, I wanted to survey how this sacralized and unfortunately mainstream Islamic hatred has resulted in chronic anti-Jewish persecution, interspersed with paroxysms of mass violence against Jews living under Muslim rule across space and time, and most importantly, what this living doctrine and history means for the modern era's collective Jew, i.e. Israel. And then I wanted to share with you a thought experiment that I performed, which demonstrates how the Jewish intelligentsia in particular remains willfully blind to the doctrinal and historical origins of the Islam in Muslim Jew hatred. So I was influenced to write my first book by the by the cataclysmic acts of jihad terrorism, and that's what happened on 9/11. These were acts of jihad. I grew up in New York, as did my wife. One of our renal fellows, I'm in a division of kidney diseases at Brown University. One of our renal fellows' his wife was in the second tower. She did manage to get out, but between accounting for her in particular and lots of friends and colleagues in New York, obviously it was a very harrowing day. It was a very harrowing day for the nation. And my wife and I were both quite wired, and on the way home, I happened to pick up a book on Islam by Karen Armstrong, who, as I later learned, is a rather notorious apologist for Islam. And so the television is blaring in the background, and my wife and I, again, are still quite wired. We can't go to sleep. We're watching all the news accounts. And I started reading her some passages from Ms. Armstrong's book, which I found rather revoltingly apologetic and treacly, and that was my reaction. My wife's reaction was more blunt. She just laughed. And I said, honey, I don't really find this very funny. I mean, this is the same sort of prattle that I'm hearing on the television screen, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. And frankly, it angered me. And one thing led to another. I wound up reading all the work of a great independent scholar, Batya Orr, and the work of her husband, historian David Littman. They in turn introduced me to a man who's become a very dear friend, who Nani knows well, Ibn Warq. And Ibn Warq wound up living with us for about 3 weeks when he was going through his visa process. He's well on his way to becoming a complete U.S. citizen. And he encouraged me. I had started to write a few essays. He encouraged me to write a book. And I said, well, the only way I'll write a book is if you'll write a foreword. So that was sort of my challenge to him. And he did graciously agree, and he wound up writing a beautiful foreword to my first book, The Legacy of Jihad. And just very briefly, what I discovered in researching The Legacy of Jihad was that this is a timeless institution. It's an eternal way in which Islam relates to the rest of the world. It is obviously warfare on one level, but it is also propaganda, it is also persuasion, it is also waged via culture, and its goal is very simple. Its goal is to subjugate the entire globe to one uniform system of law, Islamic law, the Sharia. In the course of the initial waves of conquests, in medical school and maybe other professional schools, when there's a massive material to memorize, you come up with mnemonic devices. So my mnemonic for jihad war, particularly the war-like aspect of it, was MPED, massacre, pillage, enslavement, and deportation. So again, despite the apologetics that one heard around the time of 9/11 about hijacking, about religion of peace, etc., when you looked at how Islam spread so rapidly within 100 years of Muhammad's passing, it was through warfare. And it was through bloody, violent conquest, and there were many waves which followed this initial period. So you had an Arab wave, you had a Turco-Mongol waves, you had smaller jihads waged in other parts of the world, across Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the primary method was warfare. I was also very interested, and I got into some discussion of this, about what was the system that was imposed upon the vanquished populations, those that weren't eliminated entirely. So, for example, essentially Zoroastrianism was eliminated from Iran. A tiny vestige remained. Buddhism was extirpated from major parts of India. Most of Eastern Christianity was decimated. There is still a remnant, obviously, which exists even to this day, particularly Coptic Christian populations in Egypt, but dramatically reduced in influence and in number. So the system that was imposed upon these vanquished populations that survived was I thought, elegantly termed dhimitude. So the dhimmi condition, coming from Quran 9:29, the ninth surah of the Quran is a series of timeless war proclamations. And in verse 29, it talks about waging war specifically against people of the book, meaning Jews and Christians primarily, but also the Zoroastrians were considered to have a text, and they too were granted this status of submission, humiliation, if they accepted the rule of Islamic law. Pagans, Buddhists, Hindus, etc., were not supposed to even get this status. They had a simple option, conversion or death. Now, as a contingency, because of, particularly with Hindu civilization, the numbers were so vast, and you can see this in the correspondence when, in the early 8th century, Muhammad bin Qasim is engaged in the first Arab invasions of India. He writes back to the governor of Iraq at the time, who had dispatched him, that, look, I can't kill all these people. This is not a viable option. And so there was dhimmi status was sort of grudgingly granted to the Hindus, despite the fact that they weren't scripturary peoples. And this was a hotly debated issue amongst Muslim theologians for 1,000 years after the initial waves of conquest of India. Should the Hindus, this would always come up, the more pious theologians would argue that, these cow worshippers need to be slaughtered. You can't grant them dhimmi status. But as a contingency, dhimmi status was in fact granted to the Hindus. And I was thinking, in terms of my second book, of doing, Bhatyar had done a magnificent treatment, particularly of how the system of dhimitude was imposed upon Jews and Christians, in 2 books, in the dhimmi, and then in a particularly magisterial work which focused on the Christian populations of the Near East, the decline of Eastern Christianity under Islam. And what I wanted to do was address more broadly, particularly Hindu civilization, Buddhist civilization, animist societies, and do a work on the system of dhimitude as it applied to them in particular. And I was reading about Hindu civilization, and I was well into planning out this book, and I came across the writings of Sirhindi, who died in 1624, and he was a Sufi theologian, and he was very upset by the rather progressive reforms of Akbar. Now, Akbar was a Mughal ruler in the 16th century. He started out as a very pious and rather bloody jihadist, waging additional campaigns against the unvanquished Hindus of the Indian subcontinent. And he had a change of heart and became almost what I would say a Muslim Hindu syncretist. And he engaged in far broad-ranging reforms, where he abolished some of the more stringent laws of the Sharia with regard to the non-Muslims and the Hindus specifically, including this jizya payment, which is part of Quran 9:29. It's a very humiliating poll tax. In fact, again, perhaps because Hindus were not supposed to have been granted this status in the first place, there were various humiliating rituals associated with the collection of the poll tax. Sort of mock beheadings, hitting on the neck, hitting in the face, hitting on the protuberance of the mandible, the jaw. And with the Hindus, there was sorry, I have to share this with you. There was a particularly humiliating ritual, which was you can see it discussed by the Muslim theologians rather proudly and triumphantly, and very poignantly, and in a depressed state by Hindu chroniclers, sort of complementing the Muslim narrative from the perspective of those victimized, where the Muslim tax collector could demand that the Hindu open his mouth, and they would spit into the mouth of the Hindu as a form of humiliation. But to his credit, Akbar was interested in elevating the Hindus and making them more integrated into Mughal society, and his reforms were, of course, anathema to the Muslim ulema, including Sirhindi. So I'm planning this follow-up to the Legacy of Jihad. And so, for example, here's, and I could understand Sirhindi's attitude towards the Hindus expressed this way. He says, the real purpose of levying jizya on them, the Hindus, is to humiliate them to such an extent that on account of fear of jizya, this poll tax, they may not be able to dress well and to live in grandeur. They should constantly remain terrified and trembling. It is intended to hold them under contempt and to uphold the honor and might of Islam. And he says cow sacrifice, which of course is horrific to Hindus. Cow sacrifice in India is the noblest of Islamic practices. The kafirs, the infidels, may probably agree to pay jizya, but they shall never concede to cow sacrifice, which was done as a particularly strong form of humiliation. And then, at the end of this anti-Hindu tract, which I understood, he says, whenever a Jew is killed, it is for the benefit of Islam. And this really jumped out at me and really became the inspiration for verging away from a sort of broad tapestry on the dhimmi condition for populations other than Jews and Christians, and getting back to this issue of Islamic anti-Semitism. In doing some further research on Sirhindi, there was no evidence that he had ever been in contact with a Jew. So it struck me that this sort of this false paradigm of Islam not having theological anti-Semitism couldn't be true. This paradigm couldn't be true. How could these sentiments emerge from a learned theologian who had no direct exposure? It couldn't have been a political statement, etc., etc. And it led me to re-examine the textual sources, and I want to share some of those with you because we're seeing them in evidence today.
القرآن المكي بطبيعته لم يتعرض للحديث عن اليهود إلا ما ندر، فنجد سورة بأكملها، سورة مكية بأكملها تحمل اسم يعني اليهود أو بني إسرائيل. هذا أمر غريب، والأغرب من أنها جاءت تتكلم عن اليهود ليس يهود بني قينقاع وبني النضير ويهود بني قريظة وخيبر، وإنما جاءت تتكلم عن يهود هذا العصر، يهود هذا القرن، وليست بأية لغة، إنما بلغة إعلان الفناء، بلغة حفر القبر، بلغة يعني لاحظ أن سورة الإسراء حكمت بالفناء على اليهود قبل أن يكون يهودي واحد على هذه الأرض. سورة الإسراء أعلنت عن انهيار ما يعرف بدولة إسرائيل قبل أن تقوم هذه الدولة. أن بركة فلسطين تتعلق بالقضاء على بؤرة الفساد العالمية فيها. رأس الأفعى عندما تقطع رأس الأفعى هنا في فلسطين، رأس أفعى الفساد، وتتقطع أوصال أخطبوطها في العالم كله، هنا ستحل البركة الحقيقية بالقضاء على يهود هنا في فلسطين. هذا من أروع ألوان البركة الحقيقية لفلسطين، والذي ستتبعه دائرة بركة أكبر والحمد لله رب العالمين عندما يكون هذا تأسيسا لخلافة راشدة تعم الأرض.
This is the Deputy Speaker of the Hamas Parliament. Now.
قال الله سبحانه وتعالى: وإن تأذن ربك ليبعثن عليهم إلى يوم القيامة من يسومهم سوء العذاب إن ربك لسريع الحساب إن ربك لسريع العقاب وإنه لغفور رحيم. الله أكبر. قال المفسرون في هذه الآية الكريمة: إن الله ليسلطن أمة محمد على بني يهود إلى يوم القيامة حتى يندحروا وحتى يمسخهم الله سبحانه وتعالى كما مسخهم حينما عصوا الله سبحانه وتعالى. ولذلك الله سبحانه وتعالى سلط أمة محمد والشعب الفلسطيني المجاهد على هؤلاء من إخوان القردة والخنازير حتى نكنسهم بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى من أرضنا ومن مقدساتنا.
النهارده يبقى شويه مختلف لانه ضيفتنا هتكون طفله مسلمه بس فعلا مسلمه. المفروض ان شاء الله ربنا يقدرنا وكلنا نربي ولادنا نفس التربيه دي بحيث يطلع كل الجيل الجاي اولادنا كلهم مسلمين صح، فاهمين يعني ايه مسلمين وفاهمين اعدائهم مسلمين. الطفله دي هتعرف دلوقتي على نفسها. هي بنت اخريه في الله والده وبنت فنان مصري عربي وهي اسمها بسمله وتسالها خليل. السلام عليكم. اسمك ايه؟ بسمله عندك كام سنه؟ 3 سنين. انت مسلمه؟ بسمله انت تعرفي اليهود؟ تحبيهم؟ لا ما تحبيهمش ليه؟ عشان هم ايه؟ عشان هم قردة وخنازير؟ مين قال عليهم كده؟ قال عليهم خير؟ قال عليهم في القرآن. طب وبسمله اليهود بيعملوا ايه؟ بيعملوا ايه؟ انت بتعرفي المقاطعة كمان بسمله؟ وهم كانوا بيحبوا سيدنا محمد الرسول عليه السلام؟ لا كانوا ليه كانوا بيعملوا فيه ايه اليهود؟ طبعا سيدنا محمد كان قوي يقدر يتم. طيب انت تعرفي حديث عن اليهود مع سيدنا محمد عملوا فيه ايه؟ ايه؟ في قصة انت عارفاها؟ ايه؟ اليهودية عملت ايه سيدنا محمد عليه السلام؟
This is very recent, and this has generated a lot of controversy. Now the PA Mufti, of course, this is not, that was, I've shown you a couple of things that were from Hamas. This is from the PA Mufti, the current PA Mufti, and now he's denying the context for this. And of course there is only one context, but, and fortunately Netanyahu, finally an Israeli prime minister, is reacting to this kind of sacralized hatred, but here we go.
لأن حربنا مع أبناء القردة والخنازير هي حرب دينية عقائدية. فلتحيا فتح، تحيا. تفضل شيخنا الجليل.
47 عام عن انطلاقة الثورة. أي الثورة؟ الثورة الحديثة، الثورة الحديثة في تاريخ الشعب الفلسطيني، وإلا فلسطين كلها ثورة في الواقع. منذ جاء عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنه إلى يومنا هذا وإلى أن يرث الله الأرض ومن عليها. ففي صحيح الحديث وفي الصحيحين يقول لنا البخاري ومسلم: لا تقوم الساعة حتى تقاتلوا اليهود. فيختبئ اليهودي وراء الحجر أو الشجر فينادي الحجر أو الشجر: يا مسلم يا عبد الله، هذا يهودي ورائي، تعال فاقتله. إلا شجر الغرقد. لذلك ليس عجيبا أن تروا الغرقد يحيط بالمستوطنات ويحيط بالمستعمرات.
That's it. I think you've seen enough. What I wanted to emphasize here is, first of all, if we go back to the first clip, one of the verses that the speaker invokes, well, a couple of other things to realize, is that you're often seeing people who are, particularly in the case of Hamas, they are not only clerics, they're members of parliament. And that pinpoints a problem right off the bat, which is the failure of Islam to separate religion and politics to this day. So it's not at all uncommon to have these kinds of dual roles, politicians, clerics at the same time. But the first speaker, who was a Hamas cleric, talked about actually a verse from the opening surah, the opening chapter of the Quran. Interestingly, the Quran, part of the reason that novices have so much trouble with the Quran is that its organizing principle has nothing to do with chronology. So, for example, the opening surah, the Fatiha, is a very short surah. But surahs chapters 2 to 114 are arranged purely on the basis of longest to shortest. And so you get this rambling, discursive narrative, which is very, very difficult to follow. And of course, to understand it, you need to refer to the Quranic commentaries, to the Hadith, to the Sirah. The Hadith are the words, deeds, and even physical gestures of Muhammad. A crude analogy might be the Gospels. As recorded by his pious earliest Muslim companions, the Sirah are the earliest sacralized Muslim biographies of Muhammad. So without the Quranic commentaries, without the Hadith, without the Sirah, it's very, very difficult often to interpret many parts of the Quran. But the seventh verse of this opening surah, which is repeated by pious Muslims up to about 17 times a day during their 5 different prayer sessions, is an eternal curse upon the Jews and Christians. So the Jews are those who've incurred Allah's anger or wrath, and the Christians are those who've gone astray. And this is something that has been emphasized across a span of 13 centuries in the major Quranic commentaries. So I have this wonderful version of the Quran that was published under Saudi sponsorship. But it's what's unique about it is that it really includes a lot of references, in some cases to commentaries, but also to the Hadith. And so of course, in helping to explain this verse, they cite a canonical Hadith where Muhammad himself says that, well, those who've incurred Allah's anger are the Jews, and those who've gone astray are the Christians. And again, for 13 centuries, from mainstream exegeses, from mainstream Quranic commentaries, that is the reference. The other thing that these early clips show you is that the situation in historical Palestine is linked to global jihad, to conquests that extend way beyond this regional or localized conflicts, to Europe, to North and South America, in the case of the second Hamas cleric. And then frequent references, even unfortunately by this 3-year-old child, to the Jews as apes or apes and pigs. These are all Quranic references. So Quran 560 refers to the Jews as apes and pigs. Quran 265 and 7166 to the Jews as apes. And Muhammad himself, before he orchestrates the slaughter of the Jewish tribe Banu Qurayza, and this you have to go to the Sirah, to the important, certainly the 2 most important biographies of Muhammad by Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Sa'd, and that's That's how he refers to the Jews that he subsequently slaughters before engaging in that slaughter as apes. And so these motifs, particularly the Jews as apes or apes and pigs, have been used historically to incite slaughter of the Jews across space and time. So pogroms in Spain, supposedly tolerant Muslim Spain, North Africa, Iraq, Iran. These motifs have been invoked to incite or to celebrate the slaughter of Jewish populations during pogroms. And then, of course, this thing that's made the news recently is an invocation. Now we're moving to Islamic eschatology, or end of times theology. And the Jews play a very central role, unfortunately, in the end of times, in ushering in the end of times. In both Shiite and Sunni theology, the Jews must be slaughtered to usher in the end of times. And obviously, this dates from the canonical texts themselves, but you'll also see it referred to in explanations of Quranic verses. It was alluded to. It's not something from the modern period. In the modern era, however, the ex-Mufti of Jerusalem frequently included this in his propagandistic tracts, whether he was trying to organize Bosnian Muslims or in the Middle East itself. And of course, in the Hamas charter, this canonical hadith plays a prominent role, along with other of the motifs that you've seen. So literally the first in the preamble to the Hamas Charter is Quran 3:112. What is all this anger about? The Jews have engendered Allah's anger because they've killed the biblical prophets and transgressed against the will of Allah. This is literally how the Hamas covenant opens up in its preamble. And the Hamas covenant is actually very useful in terms of seeing how these classical motifs are put together into a founding political statement that calls for ultimately for the annihilation of the Jews by jihad. So the whole covenant is really it sort of goes back and forth between this sort of virulent anti-Semitism and jihad as the solution or ultimate solution. And even when European motifs that we would recognize, like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, are referred to in the covenant, they are referred to as essentially validating purely Islamic motifs. So when the protocols are invoked, you'll also see reference to verse like Quran 5:64, which calls the Jews spreaders of corruption. So we really have to move away from, I think, this existing paradigm that somehow, the Arab Muslim, the larger Muslim world, was infected by European motifs. They just see validation in things like the protocols, in Christian anti-Semitic motifs, and obviously in all the vast, hideous armamentarium of anti-Semitism that the Nazis mustered. And this is critically important because if there are efforts to denazify the Middle East, to ban the selling of the protocols, to ban Mein Kampf, etc., which is a very popular seller in the Middle East, you would still be left with the core residual, which the Jewish intelligentsia does not appear interested in dealing with, and this is a critical flaw. And I think these videos should drive that point home. The other thing is that obviously we're living in an era where no one would deny that anti-Semitism is particularly rampant. And one of the reasons for this, I think, again, has to do with the notion of the Jews having breached the Dhimma. So this is not a purely Judeo-centric motif. The same thing would happen to, and is happening to any dhimmi population that somehow liberated itself from the Sharia. So this amplifies, in the case of the Jews, it amplifies this virulent mainstream anti-Semitic theology. But it's another powerful source. So Israel is considered to have been a land conquered by jihad and a permanent part of the Dar al-Islam. So on a political level, it is anathema that it should be liberated from the Sharia, and that even as the Muslims themselves will remind us, a piece of this territory should no longer be under the Sharia. Now, when I was doing some background research actually on the Mufti, this was just purely by coincidence. I came across a very, very interesting a document. And there was a couple of points I wanted to make before I get to that. Recently there was some polling data coming out of actually the rather leftist Israel Foundation. This is Clinton's pollster, Greenberg. And he found that a face-to-face survey in Arabic of 1,010 Palestinian adults in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip revealed that almost 75% of them agreed with the dictates of this annihilationist hadith that the PA Mufti just recited a week and a half ago. So these motifs are very, very much alive. And that in essence, that motif is really the follow-up to this idea in the Quran that the Jews are prophet killers. So it really follows this perfect archetypal logic, which would now extend into the Hadith, where the Jews themselves are, as the little girl said, are accused of poisoning Muhammad. And in fact, when we look further at the traditions, Muhammad is believed to have died from what amounts to this Jewish conspiracy. Ultimately, even though he survived the initial poisoning attempt, the Jews are ultimately, quote, credited or discredited as a result of having caused his poisoning. So again, the logic is completed now. The Jews are responsible for killing Muhammad as well. And another interesting thing that you will see, I didn't include it, there's just so many of these depressing motifs, is that the basic split in Islam between Sunni and Shiite, this is not found in the Hadith even. It's in some early Sunni historiographies by the great polymath and historian Tabari, who died in 923. You will see reference to this sectarian split as being a Jewish conspiracy. Dating back to a period of Islam's so-called political innocence, that it was Abdullah ibn Saba, who was a Yemenite Jew who converted to Islam and in fact foments the Shiite revolution against the Sunnis, etc., etc. So it's a Jew that's responsible for this primal breach of Islam's political innocence. So these are all conspiratorial themes that have absolutely nothing to do with anything that came out of the West and Europe. I mean, these are indigenous, intrinsic themes. And now you can see how, when independent themes that have come out of the West would validate these themes. But it is putting the cart before the horse to claim that somehow this innocent, tolerant civilization was infected by conspiratorial Jew hatred from the West. But I digressed. But getting back to what I wanted to say about this fascinating, what turned out to be a fatwa that I found in the Mufti's file. It was declassified, the CIA file was declassified less than 10 years ago. And I finally made a trip. I urge everyone to go at some point. It's a fascinating place, to the U.S. National Archives. And so, you have to go through this whole rigmarole of bureaucratic procedures to get your hands on materials, and they watch you like a hawk, and you can photocopy certain things. And I'm going through the Mufti's file, and some of it's illegible, and some of it's just boring. And then I stumbled across this fatwa that was written January 5th, 1956, by the Grand Mufti of Egypt, at the time, Sheikh Hassan Mamoun, and it was signed by all the leading clerics of the different Sunni Islamic schools of jurisprudence. There are four major schools: the Hanbali, the Hanafi, the Shafi'ite, the Maliki. So all of the heads of these different areas of jurisprudence signed on to this fatwa, and it was published in Arabic in Al-Aram, and some thoughtful person in the U.S. Embassy, fluent in Arabic, appreciated its significance and translated it into English, and God only knows why it wound up in the Mufti's file, but at least it was the period that the Mufti himself resided in Egypt. So someone shoved it into his file, and there it was. And this is early in 1956. It's 9 months or so before the 56 war breaks out, the Sinai War. So it has nothing to do with the heat of the moment of that conflagration. And it is really a very revealing mainstream example of these conjoined motivations of jihad and conspiratorial Jew hatred. So let me read you some extracts from it. Muslims cannot conclude peace with those Jews who have usurped the territory of Palestine and attacked its people and their property in any manner which allows the Jews to continue as a state in that sacred Muslim territory. As Jews have taken a part, and here it's admitted, a part of Palestine, and there established their non-Islamic government, and have also evacuated from that part most of its Muslim inhabitants, jihad, to restore the country to its people, is the duty of all Muslims, not just those who can undertake it. And since all Islamic countries constitute the abode of every Muslim, the jihad is imperative for both the Muslims inhabiting the territory attacked and Muslims everywhere else, because even though some sections have not been attacked directly, the attack nevertheless took place on a part of the Muslim territory, which is a legitimate residence for any Muslim. Everyone knows, now here's the conspiratorial Jew hatred, everyone knows that from the early days of Islam to the present day, the Jews have been plotting against Islam and Muslims and the Islamic homeland. They do not propose to be content with the attack they made on Palestine and Al-Aqsa Mosque, but they plan for the possession of all Islamic territories from the Nile to the Euphrates. So you can't get more authoritative than this. Al-Azhar University is the Vatican of Sunni Islam. This is not Hamas. Now, Hamas repeats these kinds of motifs in its covenant. But to isolate and say that Hamas is somehow quote unquote radical Islam and it's a separate, distinct entity that we can compartmentalize as being opposed to the mainstream is absolutely ridiculous. More importantly, I think, for our era, is to see that I'll try and put two things together here, because I'm staring at one on the floor. In the Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, I took considerable effort to translate significant extracts from what turned out to be the magnum opus of the late Sheikh Muhammad Tantawi. Now, Tantawi worked his way up through the clerical hierarchy, and his PhD thesis is a 700-page work called Jews in the Quran and the Traditions. And this was put together in the late 1960s, and it wound up to be his ticket to stardom in the Muslim world. He eventually became the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, where he served for 14 years until his death in March of 2010. And so I felt that it was a critically important work to understand. Now, mind you, this would be when you see the material. I'll give you the crux of his ideas, but it's virulently anti-Semitic. But basically, this would be equivalent to then Cardinal Ratzinger making his life work an enormous compendium of all the anti-Semitic motifs from Christianity, celebrating them, extolling them for all times, and then the Vatican in our era saying, this is a man worthy of being the Pope. That's what this amounts to. And so here's the gist of what he says in his magnum opus. The Quran describes the Jews with their own particular degenerate characteristics, i.e. killing the prophets of Allah. Again, Quran 261, 3, 112. Corrupting his words by putting them in the wrong places, consuming the people's wealth frivolously, refusal to distance themselves from the evil they do. These are all Quranic references. And other ugly characteristics caused by their deep-rooted lasciviousness. Only a minority of the Jews keep their word. All Jews are not the same. The good ones become Muslims. This is Quran 3:113. The bad ones do not. You know, this is, and he went on, he wound up having a quote-unquote dialogue where he says that the idea of this dialogue is to put a stick into the eye of your opponent with the then chief rabbi of Israel, Israel Meir Lau, and he around that time he said, referring back to this PhD thesis that I just read you an extract from, that, he still believed every word in that thesis. He went on to, again, describe the Jews as the enemies of Allah, descendants of apes and pigs in April 2002, and he legitimized homicide bombing of Jews right after the Netanya massacre. So he didn't disavow it even after the Netanya massacre. And this is the Sunni equivalent of the Muslim Pope. So you can't get more mainstream than this. And it's not surprising then that these kinds of attitudes would lead in different historical periods to massive pogroms. And I want to describe that to you, but I think equally poignant is what happens in terms of between these paroxysms of mass violence, the sort of chronic grinding oppression that this kind of sacralized hatred leads to. And if you'll bear with me, please, I included some material in the Legacy of Islamic Antisemitism from historical Palestine itself, because I think this is critically important. First of all, it's a very poorly recognized history. You have to go to a whole series of varied sources to put it together into one place, as I attempted to do. But this is the plight of the vanquished Jews in their indigenous homeland under Islam. And this is their chronic situation. And I think it really bears reflection. So I'll just read to you a few passages, some of my own summaries, and then some eyewitness accounts. Perhaps the clearest outward manifestation of the inferiority and humiliation of the dhimmis were the prohibitions, again, so this is now not just applying to Jews, it's Jews and Christians, the prohibitions regarding their dress codes and demands that distinguishing signs be placed on the entrances of dhimmi houses. During the Abbasid Caliphates, again, another one of these sort of wandering golden ages, during the Abbasid Caliphates of Harun al-Rashid, from 786 to 809, and al-Mutawakkil, 847 to 861, Jews and Christians were required to wear yellow. This is a millennium before the Nazis. This is before anything the Vatican imposed, as patches attached to their garments or hats. Later, to differentiate further between Christians and Jews, the Christians were required to wear blue. In 850, consistent with Quranic verses associating them with Satan and hell, and there are numerous verses, al-Mutawakkil decreed that Jews and Christians attach wooden images of devils to the doors of their homes to distinguish them from the homes of Muslims. And of course, as Batyor points out, these kinds of actions led to, quote, a wave of religious persecution, forced conversions, and the elimination of churches and synagogues. Moving forward about 2 centuries, Solomon ben Jerohim, the wise, who was a major Karaite exegete who lived in mid-10th century Jerusalem, observed the following. What can you say about a people, the Muslims, who curse you when you greet them, and when you do not greet them, humiliate you and offend you? When you talk to them, they want you to differ with them so that you be considered a sinner. I have learned that the Jews of Samarkand, now he's talking about outside of Palestine, in the region where they say God is one, people who hear it testify that by saying so, they have become Muslims. Therefore, if they want to remain Jews, they can only resort to saying there are 1,000 gods, or 10, or less, or more. Then the Muslims say, you are indeed infidels, and will let them hold their religion. The calamities inflicted upon the Jews under Islam are countless. Moving ahead to Isaac ben Samuel of Acre, who lived from 1270 to 1350. And he was one of the outstanding Kabbalists of his time. And interestingly, he concluded, despite the persecutions under Christendom, that it was preferable for him to live under Christendom in this period. And so he actually fled after being imprisoned when Acre was taken from the Crusaders by the Mamluks. And here's what he says. They, the Muslims, strike upon the head of the children of Israel who dwell in their lands, and they thus extort money from them by force. For they say in their tongue, Mal al-Yahudi Muba, it is lawful to take money of the Jews. For in the eyes of the Muslims, the children of Israel are as open to abuse as an unprotected field. In their law and statutes, they rule that the testimony of a Muslim, now this is not just for Jews, this is for dhimmis in general, is always to be believed against that of a Jew. For this reason, our rabbis of blessed memory have said, rather beneath the yoke of Edom, of Christendom, than that of Ishmael. So now we're into the end of the 13th century. Then I wanted to read to you, moving ahead to 1700. This is from a fascinating chronicle by Gedalia of Shibiatsi, a Polish Jew who traveled to Jerusalem and wrote something called Pray for the Peace of Jerusalem. And he wrote this to try and garner money for the Jews who were suffering at this time. And please bear with me, it's an extended but very poignant extract. And this is we're now almost 1,000 years after the first extract that I read to you, across the continuum, across different Muslim empires, different Muslim rulers. But listen to what he says. We Jews were obliged to give a large sum of money to the Muslim authorities in Jerusalem in order to be allowed to build a new synagogue. Although the old synagogue was small and we only wanted to enlarge it very slightly, it was forbidden under Islamic law to modify the least part. In addition to the expenses and bribes destined to win the favor of the Muslims, each male was obliged to pay an annual poll tax of 2 pieces of gold to the Sultan. The rich man was not obliged to give more, but the poor man could not give less. Every year, generally during the festival of the Passover, and generally during the festival, an official from Constantinople would arrive in Jerusalem. He who did not have the means to pay the tax was thrown into prison, and the Jewish community was obliged to redeem him. So collective punishment. The official remained in Jerusalem for about 2 months, and consequently, during that period, the poor people would hide wherever they could. This is copiously documented in the Geniza documentary record by Goitain over centuries. But if ever they were caught, they would be redeemed by community funds. The official sent his soldiers throughout the streets to control the papers of the passers-by. For a certificate was provided to those who had already paid the tax. If anyone was found without his certificate, he had to present himself before the official with the required sum. Otherwise, he was imprisoned until such time as he could be redeemed. The Christians were also obliged to pay the poll tax. During the week, the paupers dared not show themselves outside. In their wickedness, the Muslim soldiers would go to the synagogues, waiting by the doors, requesting the certificate of payment from the congregants who emerged. No Jew or Christian is allowed to ride a horse, but a donkey is permitted, for in the eyes of Muslims, Christians and Jews are inferior beings. The Muslims do not allow any member of another faith, unless he converts to their religion, entry to the Temple Mount area, for they claim that no other religion is sufficiently pure to enter this holy spot. 1700. They never weary of claiming that although God had originally chosen the people of Israel, he had since abandoned them on account of their iniquities in order to choose the Muslims. So clear supersessionism. In the land of Israel, no member of any other religion besides Islam may wear the color green, even if it is a thread of cotton like that which we decorate our prayer shawls. If a Muslim perceives it, that could bring trouble. Similarly, it is not permitted to wear a green or white turban. On the Sabbath, however, we wear white turbans, on the crown of which we place a piece of cloth of another color as a distinguishing mark. The Christians are not allowed to wear a turban, but they wear a hat instead, as is customary in Poland. Moreover, the Muslim law requires that each religious denomination wear its specific garment so that each people may be distinguished from another. This distinction also applies to footwear. Indeed, the Jews wear shoes of a dark blue color, whereas Christians wear red shoes. No one can use green, for this color is worn solely by Muslims. The latter are very hostile towards Jews and inflict upon them vexations in the streets of the city. The common folk persecute the Jews, for we are forbidden to defend ourselves against the Turks or the Arabs. This is the period of Ottoman rule. If an Arab strikes a Jew, he, the Jew, must appease him, but dare not rebuke him, for fear that he may be struck even harder, which they, the Arabs, do without the slightest scruple. This is the way the Oriental Jews, remember this is a Polish Jew writing this, react, for they are accustomed to this treatment. Whereas the European Jews, who are not yet accustomed to suffer being assaulted by the Arabs, insult them in return. Even the Christians are subjected to these vexations. If a Jew offends a Muslim, the latter strikes him a brutal blow with his shoe in order to demean him, without anyone's being able to prevent him from doing it. The Christians fall victim to the same treatment, and they suffer as much as the Jews, except that the former are very rich by reason of the subsidies that they receive from abroad. And they use this money to bribe the Arabs. As for the Jews, they do not possess much money with which to oil the palms of the Muslims, and consequently, they are subject to much greater suffering. Now, to be fair, the Ottoman Empire, under tremendous pressure and defeat by the European powers, was forced to engage in what the Ottomans considered to be quote-unquote capitulations. But essentially, these were what turned out to be half-hearted and, regardless, unsuccessful attempts to reform some of these brutally discriminating aspects of the Sharia, the so-called Tanzimat reforms. The first round was iterated around 1839. There were later rounds, none of which were successful. I'm going to read you another extract. This is from 1847, again in Palestine, by the Jewish travelogue writer J.J. Binyamin II. Deep misery, again, this is after the Tanzimat reforms were at least attempted. Deep misery and continual oppression are the right words to describe the condition of the children of Israel in the land of their fathers. They are entirely destitute of every legal protection and every means of safety. Instead of security afforded by law, which is unknown in these countries, they are completely under the orders of the sheikhs and pashas, men whose character and feelings inspire but little confidence from the beginning. It is only the European consuls who frequently take care of the oppressed and afford them some protection. With unheard of rapacity, tax upon tax is leveled on them, and with the exception of Jerusalem, the taxes demanded are arbitrary. Whole communities have been impoverished by the exorbitant claims of the sheikhs, who, under the most trifling pretenses and without being subject to any control, oppress the Jews with fresh burdens. In the strict sense of the word, the Jews are not even masters of their own property. They do not even venture to complain when they are robbed and plundered. Their lives are taken into as little consideration as their property, their lives. They are exposed to the caprice of anyone, even the smallest pretext, even a harmless discussion, a word dropped in conversation, is enough to cause bloody reprisals. Violence of every kind is of daily occurrence. When, for instance, in the contests of Muhammad Ali, so this was internecine struggle within the Muslim Empire, with the Sublime Porte, with the Ottomans, the city of Hebron was besieged by Egyptian troops and taken by storm. The Jews were murdered and plundered, and the survivors scarcely even allowed to retain a few rags to cover themselves. No pen can describe the despair of these unfortunates, and I have some eyewitness accounts of this in the compendium. The women were treated with brutal cruelty, and even to this day many are found who since that time are miserable cripples. With truth can the lamentations of Jeremiah be employed here. Since that great misfortune, up to the present day, the Jews of Hebron languish in the deepest misery, and the present sheikh is unwearied in the endeavors, not to allow their condition to be ameliorated, but on the contrary, he makes it worse. The chief evidence of their miserable condition is the universal poverty which we remarked in Palestine, and which is here truly astonishing. For nowhere else in our long journeys in Europe, Asia, and Africa — he traveled extensively — did we observe it among the Jews. It even causes leprosy among the Jews of Palestine, as in former times. Robbed of their means of subsistence from the cultivation of the soil and the pursuit of trade, they exist upon the charity of their brethren in the faith in foreign parts. In a word, the state of the Jews in Palestine, physically and mentally, is an unbearable one. Now, given this kind of chronic persecution, it's not surprising then, I would think, to see what happens in terms of full-fledged pogroms. And so what I'm going to just quickly summarize for you is a series across space and time of mass murders, pogroms, violence committed against Jews in Islamdom. Without getting into all the details about them, maybe we can talk about this a little bit in the discussion. They were the result of specific incitement, anti-Semitic motifs. 6,000 Jews massacred in Fez in 1033. Hundreds of Jews slaughtered in Muslim Cordoba between 1010 and 1015. 4,000 Jews killed in Muslim riots in Grenada in 1066, wiping out the entire community. By the way, in this particular pogrom, more Jews were killed in this one pogrom than were killed in the ravages 30 years later when the Crusaders set out for Palestine and ravaged the Jewish communities of the Rhineland. This was a much more extensive massacre. The Berber Almohad depredations of Jews and Christians in Spain and North Africa between 1130 and 1232, which killed tens of thousands while forcibly converting thousands more and subjecting the forced Jewish converts to Islam to a Muslim inquisition. This is what Maimonides wrote about. The 1291 pogroms in Baghdad and its environs, which killed at least hundreds of Jews. The 1465 pogrom against the Jews of Fez. The late 15th century pogrom against the Jews of the southern Moroccan oasis of Tuat. The 1679 pogroms against and then expulsion of 10,000 Jews from Sana'a, Yemen, to the unlivable, hot, and dry plain of Tihama, from which only 1,000 returned alive in 1680, 90% having died from exposure. Recurring Muslim anti-Jewish violence, including pogroms and forced conversions, throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, which rendered areas of Iran, for example, Tabriz, Judenrein. And that was the first time I had seen this word in a context outside of Europe. The 1834 pogrom in Safat, this was during the Muhammad Ali era, where raging Muslim mobs killed and grievously wounded hundreds of Jews. The 1888 massacres of Jews in Isfahan and Shiraz, Iran. The 1910 pogrom in Shiraz. The pillage and destruction of the Casablanca, Morocco ghetto in 1907. The pillage of the ghetto of Fez, Morocco in 1912. The government sanctioned, this is the Turkish government, sanctioned anti-Jewish pogroms by Muslims in Turkish eastern Thrace during June-July 1934, this is under Ataturk, which ethnically cleansed at least 3,000 Jews. And the series of pogroms, expropriations, and finally mass expulsions of some 900,000 Jews from Arab Muslim nations, beginning in 1941 in Baghdad, the murderous Farhud, during which 600 Jews were murdered and at least 12,000 pillaged, eventually involving cities and towns in Egypt, Morocco, Libya, Syria, Aden, Bahrain, and culminating in 1967 in Tunisia, that accompanied the planning and creation of a Jewish state, Israel, on a portion of the Jews' ancestral homeland. So I'd like to conclude with the thought experiment that I alluded to at the beginning. After I had finished the major sections of my anti-Semitism compendium, including a very long survey, which was really a book length in itself. It was a 180,000-word survey, which was introducing the documents and essays by experts who described the conditions of individual Jewish communities, and then more documents, etc., which made up the rest of the book. I had come across something that's actually fascinating, and I want to share it with you. So by email, I contacted, I'll call them for lack of a better descriptor, representatives of the Jewish intelligentsia, whether they were scholars, activists, journalists, et cetera, including even an ambassador. And I said, in your opinion, would this quote, and I'll read it to you, exemplify racial or at least ethnic anti-Semitism? Moreover, would you please hazard a guess as to where and when it was written based upon the contents? And I'll read you this quote. Our people, the Muslims, observing thus the occupation of the Jews and the Christians, concluded that the religion of the Jews must compare unfavorably, as do their professions, and that their unbelief must be the foulest of all, since they are the filthiest of all nations. Why the Christians, ugly as they are physically less repulsive than the Jews, may be explained by the fact that the Jews, by not intermarrying, have intensified the offensiveness of their features. Exotic elements have not mingled with them. Neither have males of alien races had intercourse with their women, nor have their men cohabited with females of a foreign stock. The Jewish race therefore has been denied high mental qualities, sound physique, and superior lactation. The same results obtain when horses, camels, donkeys, and pigeons are inbred. So not surprisingly, and I'll read you some of the responses I got from my correspondents, they reflected the conventional academic and journalistic wisdom, or lack thereof, which continues to assert that Muslim Jew hatred is a recent phenomenon. It's a product of trends that began in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. It's a byproduct of the advent of Zionism and certainly the creation of the State of Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a loose amalgam of recycled medieval Christian Judeophobic motifs, calumnies from the protocols of the elders of Zion, and then, of course, modern racist European fascist Nazi propaganda. And so sort of a prototypical understanding of this was actually published. It was pointed out to me by Janet Levy, and I went and read it in The Looming Tower. The Looming Tower was Lawrence Wright's book about, it's actually a decent journalistic account of the 9/11 attacks. But in it, he makes the following statement, which really reflects the so-called conventional wisdom. He writes, until the end of World War II, Jews lived safely, although submissively, under Muslim rule for 1,200 years, enjoying full religious freedom. But in the 1930s, Nazi propaganda on Arabic language shortwave radio, coupled with slanders by Christian missionaries in the region, infected the area with this ancient Western prejudice. After the war, Cairo became a sanctuary for Nazis who advised the military and the government. The rise of the Islamist movement coincided with the decline of fascism, but they overlapped in Egypt, and the germ passed into a new carrier. And of course, there was no footnoting, because in fact, this was the conventional wisdom as he saw it. So now, I'm going to read you some of the responses to that quote that I read you. Again, from the Jewish intelligentsia. Of course, it's anti-Semitism of the most vile, racist stripe, which leads me to think it likely dates from the 19th century at the earliest. It sounds like the sort of thing one would read in the anti-Semitic popular literature of the Edwardian period. So my guess would be somewhere between 1830 and the 1920s. I imagine this was written under the influence of modern theories of racial inferiority. If I had to hazard a guess, I would say this is from a sermon in Gaza mosque this past Friday. Could be any mosque in the Muslim world or Nazi Germany if it weren't for the first line, definitely racial. How about current Wahhabi establishment? I have no idea who said it, but I'll hazard a guess just for sport. The Mufti of Jerusalem circa 1940. Probably last week from one of the mullahs in the United Kingdom. Yes, racist to the point of being Nazi-like, I would say the Mufti of Jerusalem or some other Islamo-fascist or maybe contemporary Wahhabi. It's the usual modern boilerplate from the Middle East. In fact, what I read to you comes from a very interesting tract that was written in the middle of the 9th century. Under al-Mutawakkil, after there had been a lot of internecine struggle in the Abbasid Empire, this was the transition from the Mutazilites back to a more traditional Islam. The Mutazilites had various sort of experiments and heresies. I mean, they were very strong jihadists, and they waged their own inquisition against Muslims who wouldn't accept their sort of pseudo-rationalistic belief system. It's a whole separate argument, and it's been beautifully elaborated by the great Ignaz Goltz here. Suffice to say, they had nothing to do with sort of presaging Western Enlightenment, as some have claimed. But regardless, Mutawakkil represented a return to Islamic orthodoxy. What he noticed, as an astute politician, was that despite the fact that the external threat to the Islamic empire came from the Christian empires, was that the population of Muslims hated the Jews much more. And so he commissioned the greatest writer of his era in Arabic, and a true polymath of that era, Al-Jahiz, to write an anti-Christian tract. But Al-Jahiz, being an intellectual and wanting to understand what was going on, confirmed, in fact, his ruler's observation that, yes, the Muslim masses indeed did hate the Jews more than the Christians, and he couldn't understand it from what you heard him write. And this is sort of, it's interesting because, he was interested in science, etc., but this was the sort of science that he engaged in. And but when it came to explaining his brethren, his Muslim co-religionists' hatred, he said there were two factors. One was a Quranic verse, which I haven't mentioned yet, Quran 582, which sort of paradoxically claims that the Jews harbor the most intense hatred for the Muslims. And of course, Muhammad's, as he put it, rancorous interactions with the Jews of Medina, where Muhammad winds up waging basically a proto-jihad against the Jews, all the usual things, massacre, killing, expulsion, enslavement, etc., etc., because of various acts of perfidy or claimed acts of perfidy committed by the Jews, who basically didn't see him as their Messiah. After all, he wasn't Jewish. So Jahiz felt that was the reason for the Muslims' visceral hatred. It was in fact theological, and he's writing this in the 9th century. Now he wants to try and change it because they're not a political threat; they're crushed. And interestingly enough, I found, better than the New York Times in our era, in the middle of the 9th century, there was another Iraqi, a Sufi, who noticed exactly the same thing, except he didn't think it was a direct result of Quran 582. He thought it was purely a result of Muhammad's rancorous interaction with the Jews of Medina, i.e., why did the Muslims hate the Jews more than the Christians? And so I think this little anecdote, in its own way, highlights the predicament. This sort of hatred and its ugly consequences are hardwired, and for whatever the reasons, the Jewish intelligentsia does not want to come to grips with this, and it's not going to go away by being ignored. And certainly that doesn't mean we should ignore all the other virulent anti-Semitism that exists. I did this almost as a lark, but it turned out to be very informative. It confirmed, frankly, my worst fears and suspicions. That, to be blunt about it, the Jewish intelligentsia doesn't have a clue, nor does it seem to want to. And it's not as if very profound Jewish thinkers from a bygone era haven't noticed this either. Although, as I explained in the book, there's a lot of the Muslim apologetic in terms of invented utopias, whether they're in Andalusia or in the Ottoman Empire, in fact, come from Jews who were trying to rewrite history in a way which they thought would teach Europe to be more tolerant of its Jews. And I understand those motivations, and I think they're deluded, but they're understandable. But it was Maimonides who pointed out in his epistle to the Jews of Yemen, and I'll just read you one very brief segment because I've read you enough, I understand that. he just says he's writing in response to he's lived through the horrible Almohad persecutions. He had to behave as a crypto convert to Islam himself. There are poignant descriptions by Ibn Aqeen, who is a contemporary of Ibn Aqeen, I'm sorry, who is a contemporary of Maimonides, who writes about the literal inquisition that was waged against the Jews. Even Jewish forced converts to Islam who were now second and third generation under the Almohads. This was unrelenting. Maimonides, though, in 1172, thereabouts it's believed, writes his epistle to the Jews of Yemen, and he's responding to a wave of persecutions and forced conversions in Yemen, far-flung Yemen. And Yemen was, as I mentioned, was a land where there were no other dhimmi. All the hatred was vented at the Jews, and they were chronically besieged. And in fact, 90% of the population was exterminated as a result of a forced expulsion in 1679 to 1680. So he's responding to this plaintive appeal from the Jews of Yemen, and he writes, "God has hurled us in the midst of this people, the Arabs, the Muslims, who have persecuted us severely and passed baneful and discriminatory legislation against us. Never did a nation molest, degrade, debase, and hate us as much as they." This is Maimonides. Elsewhere in a commentary on the Torah, he makes a very interesting observation, Maimonides, that yes, he would try to share his understanding of Torah with Christians, but he warns, never, a Jew should never attempt to do that with Muslims, because they will take it as such an affront, as such a heresy, that it could endanger any Jew who would attempt to do such a thing. And Maimonides was no fan of Christianity. In the same epistle, he says very hateful things about Jesus and about digging up his grave and shaking around his bones and things. So he's not an apologist in any sense for Christianity, and he harbors the prejudices of his era. But he does point out, in terms of physical danger and reasoning, that a Jew should never try and teach his understanding of the Torah to a Muslim, because it involves an issue of safety. So these kinds of understandings have been present for a long time, and I think we need to rediscover them. Thank you very much. Go right ahead.
All right. My question is, and what is your answer to this? During the Inquisition in Spain, can everybody hear me? Yes. Yes. I speak rather loudly, so it's okay. During the Spanish Inquisition, the Ottoman Empire welcomed Jews into Turkey. What is your answer to that? What was that?
Okay, this is actually a very important point. Let me contextualize what happened. Let's go back to what I described was the horrific Almohad persecutions in the 12th and 13th century. Forced conversions, an inquisition of its own, mass killings, etc. Jews at that time actually sought and received refuge in the Christian-controlled areas of Spain. And if they renounced their forced conversion to Islam, that is, they were welcomed back as Jews who could practice their religion, within the prejudicial constraints of that era in Spain. But certainly a far better situation than what they had experienced with these mass persecutions and pogroms in Almohad-controlled parts of both North Africa and Spain. Now, as the Inquisition picks up speed in the 14th and 15th centuries, indeed, most of it is forced conversion, and the persecutions, really, it's interesting. Bibi Netanyahu's father, Ben Zion, is one of the great historians of the Inquisition, and he, along with Henry Kamen. And they point out two important things. First of all, the brutality of the Inquisition was, quote-unquote, successful in that most of the Jews converted, and in fact, crypto Judaism was not a pervasive phenomenon. There were Jews who were pious and steadfast in their belief, and most of those who were expelled wound up getting safe haven in Europe, in other tolerant parts of Western Europe. A tiny minority, because at some point there are figures that the population of the Jews swelled to 500 to 800,000 in Christian Spain. 20,000 or less were in fact granted, quote unquote, it's a special status. They were called Sürgün under the Ottoman Empire, deportation Jews. And with Sürgün came the restriction that once you were deported to location X, that's where you resided your life under pain of death. And you were, and the Sharia was imposed upon you. And what created the vacuum for those Jews? Why were these areas in need of population / repopulation? Because the expanding Ottoman conquest, the jihad conquest waged by the Ottomans, had decimated not only the Christian communities, Balkan, Byzantine, etc., but the Jewish communities that had established a modus vivendi within those areas. And those Jews were slaughtered, taken into the Dev Shemay, the slave soldier system, at least initially, until they were not, I guess, found to be very good soldiers, unlike the Christians. So you see, it's a process that is waves of persecution, and it's not a black and white situation by any stretch of the imagination. And indeed, the perspective of the Jews that had established a modus vivendi under the Byzantines was I include a lot of their writings in the book. They saw the Ottoman conquest as a calamity, as an absolute calamity, whereas, of course, the 20,000 Jews that are arriving from the Inquisition, see it as a blessing and as a liberation. So this is the perspective that's never taught. That these are. There was a similar thing that I came across 500 years or so earlier. There was a horrible wave of persecutions under the Fatimids, who as a Shiite, as a moderated Shiite sect, were sometimes more tolerant. But there was a particularly fanatical period at the beginning of the 11th century under Al-Hakim. Brutal persecution of Jews in particular, but also Christians. And we see Basil II, I believe, in the Byzantine Empire of the time, welcoming Jews into the Byzantine Empire. I mean, so Jews will go to areas where they will be tolerated. But in terms of the Spanish Inquisition, most of the Jews who received safe haven were granted safe haven in other parts of Europe, not in the Ottoman Empire. And I have seen ridiculous figures where it's claimed that 500,000 or 1 million Jews were given safe haven. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. Kamen, who I mentioned is the other great historian of the Inquisition, did some very good demographic analyses, and his conclusion was at maximum 20,000 Jews, which is significant. But the other thing that happened to these Sürgün Jews, these deportation Jews, was that as new areas, as the Ottoman Empire expanded, they could be deported once again and forced to populate additional areas against their will. And the status of Jews chronically in the Ottoman Empire, I described the situation in Palestine. That was the Ottoman Empire in 1700. That was what Gedalia of Shimazi was writing about. That was Ottoman rule. Now, it was also local rule by the Arabs that were under the Ottomans. There are the European travelers in the 18th and even into the 19th century describe the Turkish word that was used to describe Jews, chifit. It means filthy Jew. Remember the old Robert Klein thing where he's doing a stereotype of the bigoted Southerner, And he can't separate Jew from Jew bastard. You know, I mean, so it's not a Jew, it's a Jew bastard. You know, so chifit, that's the word, and it means filthy Jew. And again, another one of these myths in terms of Ottoman tolerance was again, and it was Graetz actually, Henrik Graetz, who was also responsible for writing about, in a very hagiographic way, about the experience in Muslim Spain. Was to, again, the motivations are very understandable. He was trying to teach contemporary Germans in the 19th century that you see, you can learn from Islam. Jews were part of this civilization. They could be tolerated. They can be integrated into German society as well. And so these myths were invented for that purpose. On that story, yes, all the way in the back.
Thank you very much. The untold story right now is the pogrom in the Arab and Muslim world against Christians. And it seems to be a taboo subject here. And I was wondering, has any of this...
A taboo subject here? My talk was on Islamic anti-Semitism.
I mean, it's not like you hear it on CNN.
Oh, right. No, but that's different than here.
Yeah, it's virtually taboo here. That you know, it's not... barely covered.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
And then we have, you know, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians who are very busy condemning Israel. Have they ever been confronted with the suffering of their fellow Christians?
All the time.
And can you elucidate, can you enlighten on that?
You know, where do I begin? You know, there's a third worldism that pervades the Christian left now. There's the Vatican, which unfortunately, by the way, I hate to tell you all this because there's a new book out by a very courageous Italian journalist where a lot of the progress made in terms of Vatican II is being undone now, unfortunately. But the Vatican feels that by not emphasizing this persecution, it's perverse to me, but they feel that they are protecting the trapped Christian populations from the rancor of the Muslims. So there's that motivation. You know, and of course, you know, getting back to the mainstream left churches, etc. In the end, of course, it's all our fault. Somehow it's the fault of the West for whatever they did during the colonial period, etc., etc. There was harmony. They have their myths about Islamic tolerance of Christians, just the way Jews have their myths about Islamic tolerance of Jews. So it's a mess. All these threads come together. You didn't mention perhaps the worst tragedy of all, and the most perverse, which is that our misguided adventure in Iraq, at least the long-term aspect of it, not necessarily getting rid of Saddam, has been accompanied, just like under the British adventure beforehand, with what may turn out to be the final death knell for the Assyrian Christian population on our watch, just as on the Brits' watch there were massive pogroms in the 1930s against the Assyrian Christian populations. How does one explain that? You know, other than political expediency, denial, etc., it's a horrific mess. It's a horrific mess. But I mean, again, at the heart of it, to argue simply and clearly, I think there's a denial of how this doctrine, whether it applies to Jews or other non-Muslims, has real consequences. It has real consequences, historical consequences. It's not a theory, it's a practice. Yes?
I have a question of your view regarding who or what is behind this myth promoting. And
I have a strong view about this.
and I'm sure you're familiar with Henri Perrin.
Yeah.
His views after 1945.
There's a new book. Have you seen the new reevaluation of Perrin's theory? Yeah. Yeah, revisited.
But my question is, why was this suppressed around 1945?
I don't know. I mean, there's been this sort of cultural self-loathing in the West, you know, since the World War I era. Part of it is that there's been political expediency in terms of dealing. You know, how does one deal as a colonial power with these enormous Muslim societies and all their prejudices, and how can you be protecting, you know, the minorities when you're trying to get out? You know, has been a long theme. You know, but Perrin's theory is certainly very straightforward and interesting. But you do raise an interesting. There was actually a very good story in the Daily News in 2003, which talked about materials that came to light. I think the guy's name was Larry Kohler Estes, and he wrote a piece in the Daily News about the textbooks that were being used in New York City area Islamic schools. And just to cut to the chase, and they basically were reiterating many of the anti-Semitic motifs which I reviewed for you in these textbooks. And oh, I don't know. I guess you'll consider me perverse, but I had to. You know, you have to take some morbid or morose humor in all this. When the author of some of these material was confronted by the Daily News reporter, he wasn't in a denial mode at all. He said, "Well, Islam, like any belief system, believes in its program is better than others. I don't feel embarrassed to say that. The books are directed to kids in a Muslim educational environment. They must learn and appreciate there are differences between what they have and what other religions teach. It's telling kids that we have our own tradition." And, you know, but just to help you understand, and it's repetitive in terms of what I presented, but from the report, in Long Island City, Queens, for example, 5th and 6th graders at the Ideal Islamic School on 12th Street learned that Allah revealed, and this is Quran 261, 3:112, that, quote, the Jews killed their own prophets and disobeyed Allah. Yet a third book in use at the Ideal School describes the hostile relations between Jews and the Muslim prophet Muhammad in Medina in the 7th century. The reasons for Jewish hostility lies in their general characteristics, the book says. Numerous Quranic citations follow with negative references to Jews. For example, you will ever find them deceitful, except for a few of them. This is Quran 371, 446. On Jewish hostility to Islam. The reasons for Jewish hostility toward the Muslims of 7th century Medina lies in their general characteristics described in the Quran. Example, you will find the most implacable of men in their enmity to the faithful, to the Muslims, are the Jews and pagans. That's Quran 582. This is the verse going all the way back to Jahiz in the middle of the 9th century that he claimed had engendered the hatred, the greater hatred of Muslims towards Jews, even though they were powerless relative to Christians, going back to the middle of the 9th century. This is what's still being taught in New York City area schools. Yes?
In your research, have you come across any period during either Muhammad's conquest in which his armies included any multitude of Jews who obviously were forced to convert or willing to convert, and even the Jews rose to the high rank in his army?
No, nothing that I'm aware of any significance. There were very few Jewish converts. That was part of his frustration. There were very, very few Jewish converts. You know, his converts essentially came from the pagan Arabs. From the pagan Arabs. That was more of the conquest. But no. The major converts to Islam were the pagan Arabs. Yes, all the way in the back.
Can you please tell us the beginnings of Muslim Brotherhood and why do you think President Obama embraces them?
A couple of things, and I think, again, this is part of some of the general misconceptions. Not to exculpate the Muslim Brotherhood, but, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood is a very, very legitimate mainstream interpretation. Their interpretation is very legitimate mainstream interpretation of Islam. They are not Al-Banna himself, the ideologues like Qaradawi. It's inappropriate to call them radical. They are mainstream. They express a very authentic, modern version of traditional Islam. Their origins, yeah, they actually really come more out of a continuum. You know, there were caliphate movements that began in India, much bigger than the Muslim Brotherhood, at the end of the Russo-Turkish War. There were so-called modernists like Al-Afghani at the end of the 19th century and his pupil Muhammad Abdu, and then of course Rashid Rida, who were really in direct line before Al-Banna. In fact, Abdu and Rida put out a publication called Al-Manar, the Lighthouse, and actually Hezbollah has picked up on this, and it went defunct with Rida's death in 1935. And who do you think revitalized it? Al-Banna himself. So the Muslim Brotherhood is really a continuum of mainstream revivalist movements that began in the 19th century, and people could argue there have periodically been these kinds of revivalist movements throughout the history, the turbulent history of Islam. What's also important to realize is that serious Western historians have decades ago noticed that the entire modern Muslim discourse is dominated by the thinking and discourse of the Muslim Brotherhood. This has been known for decades now. And why is that? Again, because they express a very mainstream strain, pious, traditional strain of Islam. Now, when they are engaged in all forms of we see them emerging as a result of the Arab Spring. It's interesting to then reflect back, again, it's the same sort of nonsense that we got into after 9/11 with hijacking and this, the Arab Spring was hijacked. It wasn't hijacked. We can look at hard polling data. As a matter of fact, one of the Clintons' favorite pollsters and a champion of the Clintons, Doug Schoen, published a very nice, short, concise, interesting piece on the Fox News website about last February. Mubarak, I believe, had already been deposed or was on his way out by the time Doug simply summarized polling data out of Egypt. And in February of 2011, he said, if you look at the sociologic data coming out of Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood's going to win in a landslide. So he called the election 9 months in advance, just from his perspective as a seasoned political pollster. And some of the things he noted, and which had been noted in previous surveys by Pew, etc., was, for example, roughly 85% of Egyptians said that those who forsake Islam, who are quote-unquote apostates, should be killed. That's 85% of the population. That's the Muslim Brotherhood's agenda. 73 or so percent agreed with mutilating punishments for theft. That's the Sharia. That's what the Muslim Brotherhood says. So because that's the mainstream societal beliefs. It's Orthodox Sharia. That's it. That's traditional Islam. Do this, Nani, please.
Thank you for tying up this myth that anti-Semitism did not exist, it's not part and parcel of Islam ideology, because it is. And so I thank you for that. Another thing about the idea of accusing Jews of killing prophets, of killing, trying to kill Muhammad, poison Muhammad. All of these things are happening until today. Accusations that Jews...
3-year-olds. 3-year-olds.
No, it's happening about actions of Jews today
Oh, Arafat, yeah, yeah. Right. Never mind that pederasty, but you know.
When you have an ideology that's based on comfort, on violating other people's human rights, which you clearly showed brilliantly.
But everybody, this is Noni Darwin.
And please, everybody, I had the privilege of reading Nani's new book in advance copy, and it's magnificent. I urge everyone to get it. It should be out soon, right?
Yeah, next month. And I really thank you because I learned so much from you.
Oh, thank you.
Harvard Muslim learning so much.
Well, thank you, thank you. I'm very flattered.
He knows more than so many Egyptians, Muslims, and I am just sad that most Muslims don't even know a quarter of what you know about Islam, because they really buy the propaganda. They really believe that Jews killed Yasser Arafat. They really believe Jews wanted to kill Muhammad. They really believe it. So this propaganda, we have to expose it. We have to start.
But by the way, the National Iranian Teachers Exam has a question. I read this in a book, a wonderful book about an academic book about the plight of minorities in Iran by an Iranian Armenian, Elise Sanasarian, who I believe might still be a professor out here at one of the California universities. And she points out that teachers sitting for their certification exam in Iran were asked the question, basically, who killed Muhammad? Well, the answer is a Jewess. I mean, so that's on the teacher exam.
Not multiple choice.
I guess there were other choices. Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't know, whatever. Yes.
Based on your research and so on, are the I hate to use the erroneous term Palestinian Arabs. Why don't we say the local Arabs in Judea and Samaria ever capable of accepting the existence of a Jewish state?
I think a tiny minority of extremists might be. Yeah, one last question.
He passed the baton.
Okay.
So the historical context, I think, is really fascinating. The historical context, I think, is really fascinating. My question is this, which is, what's the way forward? What's your advice on the policy of the U.S. government and people in this room and people in general, given that it's so systemic, the hatred of not only Jews but Christians but all non-believers? So that's my question.
Well, it might sound quixotic. I think first of all we have to talk about it. We have to talk about it. We have to discuss it. We have to discuss it and say how unacceptable it is. We don't tolerate the hatred of David Duke. We shouldn't tolerate this hatred, and this is far more pervasive and far more dangerous. And it's not just directed at Jews. I mean, one of the problems, and of course, I kind of fell into this trap as well, but I felt there was a need. But on the one hand, it is important to point out the theological animus. But as going again all the way back to Al-Jahiz, the political can at certain times override the theological in one sense. So we cannot separate the plight of the Jews from the plight of other non-Muslims, and this is critically important. And it is important to understand, even as the Muslim Brotherhood put it so aphoristically, first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. It is important not to make this so Judeo-centric on the one hand, but unfortunately, there is this core theological animus against Jews, and their annihilation is in fact supposed to usher in the end of times. So there's a critical motivation that we can't ignore. We have to balance that, and I think that in terms of sort of geopolitical policy. We must stop these nation-building efforts in rebuilding and remaking Muslim man in our image. I mean, this is just an absurdity. They don't want it. We must debase ourselves in the process of doing it. I mean, the rules of engagement that we have for our troops, the fact that we are bringing in Muslims to teach our Marines in Afghanistan that they shouldn't be peeing or defecating towards Mecca. This is way out of hand. And I think, one of the things, obviously, that fuels the jihad are the massive sums of money that we pay out in terms of oil purchases, and so energy independence becomes a real critical political instrument to at least at some level defund some of the jihadism coming our way. But I think it's equally important to deal with acute threats, and that's it. I mean, unless we don't have we certainly don't seem to have the will, we may no longer even have the capability to do, for example, it's very illuminating to read about what was done with Japan. And I'm not just talking about, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm talking about the aftermath. I include in my new book some of the posters that were brought to my attention by a wonderful historian about our program to delegitimize political Shinto in Japan after World War II, and so we in essence have done the opposite of that in our adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we've taken thrusting hideous academics like Noah Feldman and put him in a position to help them draft Sharia-based constitutions. This is a dangerous absurdity. So we've capitulated to promoting Sharia-based societies which are going to engender the beliefs that I've described here. So I think the policy has to change towards dealing with acute threats and getting the hell out. It's really been tragic to see how things have ultimately unfolded in both Iraq and Afghanistan.